social media, it's a lot easier kind of utilizing it on we're not live yet? Aren't 90. Just need to know. So guys, just to carry on, sorry, I thought we weren't live, but we're not live on YouTube, we're live on everything else. Sorry for that pause. Most of 98% of people, close to 99% of people, use social media on mobile, which is really quite an obvious statement. I think part of our survey, before I hand over to Arthur, part of our survey was that there's been a huge jump from our respondents, and again, thanks to the respondents that actually responded to the survey. And one of the things that make the survey different to a lot of the other surveys is this is a forward-looking survey. It's what brands, what agencies are thinking about doing on social media for the next year. So it's kind of a forward-looking survey, and it's really cool to see amongst the industry what are they planning to do in the next year. And what we found on this survey is it's been a huge jump from brands or from agencies that are really dealing in a B2B space, even more than a B2C space rather than a B2B that was last year. And I suspect because of the pandemic, it's much easier kind of getting to the market utilizing social media. So this was an opportunity for brands that are B2C really to jump onto this bandwagon. So thank you very much, Arthur. If you want to just give us an overview of the report, and then we'll go in from the questions from there.
Thanks so much, Oresti. Just give me a second. So welcome, everyone. As Oresti mentioned, we've been doing this since time immemorial. In COVID years, we started about 100 years ago, but in fact have been working together since 2012 on our social media landscape report. So it's given us a really in-depth sense of the shifts in the market. And because of the kind of shifts that we've seen, not just in user behavior, but also in brand behavior, we've termed this year's survey the Great Migration. And it's partly a result of the takeoff of usage of certain platforms that existed previously, but also new platforms, but also the takeoff of new approaches by brands. And I'm going to take you through some of the key numbers. Bear in mind that all of this information will be contained in the report that will be made available at no cost to anyone who wants to download it or access it. So what I'm giving you is a snapshot, and it's not the full picture that you can get in the report itself. But a very important point to bear in mind here is that it's no longer the numbers of users that are going to drive this industry. It's how the brands engage with those users, because we all know that people have migrated to social media and to online in ways they never have before. We saw online retail surging to an extent it never has before. And that is because of people adapting to the pandemic lifestyle. The big question is no longer whether people are going to embrace these platforms. The big question is how brands are going to engage with people on these platforms, because what the brands do will also shape the experience of the user. And therefore, the brands have a massive impact on the nature, the shape, and the experience of social media in South Africa. So we're going to start off with looking at the social corporation, how the biggest brands in South Africa are using social media. But in particular, this year, we're also looking at the challenges that face them. We surveyed 111 of the country's biggest brands, and that's a nice jump from last year. So it's a fairly persuasive set of data in terms of giving us a sense of what brands are doing. So this is what Oresti was referring to earlier, the extent to which brands have shifted from B2B to B2C. So in 2020, 57% of brands had a B2B strategy, 76% a B2C strategy. In 2021, that's moved to 88% having a B2C strategy. B2B has remained relatively similar, just under 56%, but that's a huge leap in B2C. And this is going to help shape the consumer experience of social media in this country. These are the platforms the brands are using. And the number one platform at around 94% of brands is fairly predictable because that's where most social media users in South Africa are active. But number two was quite startling, Instagram, beating out LinkedIn and Twitter. And as you'll see shortly, this is where brands are really reshaping the conversation. But again, referencing what Oresti said earlier, this is a forward-looking report, and what's most significant is what brands are planning to do, not just what they're currently doing, because that will shape the landscape. And this gives us a picture of where brands plan to be active in the next 12 months. The data set at the bottom shows you each year what brands said they would increase their usage in. And here, the big shift is in corporate blog usage. But we saw that last year as well. So 2 years in a row, we've seen massive intention to leverage corporate blogs. In other words, content that reflects the company's mission and its viewpoints are going to be quite significant. Therefore, we're seeing corporations trying to claim a voice for their own. And then the other big one, although it's a small number, it's highly significant in terms of coming from nowhere, is Clubhouse. 8% of brands are planning to be active on Clubhouse in the coming year. From zero and from a platform that didn't exist before, that is highly significant. And once Clubhouse arrives on Android, we can expect a massive leap. What it relates back to is when Instagram was first launched in South Africa. Initially, it was only on iPhones or on iOS, and uptake was fairly small but vigorous. The moment it moved to Android, we saw a massive increase in use. And this is what we can expect from Clubhouse as well, except that every other brand is seeing, or every other platform is seeing Clubhouse as a major threat or competitor and introducing Clubhouse type functions on their platforms. So that could curtail the growth of use of Clubhouse. But for now, it has a cool factor that Instagram had when it first launched. So we could expect a similar trajectory initially for Clubhouse. Then in terms of who is managing social media accounts, this is quite important when we see the extent to which companies are relying on teams of users. So marketing team, an agency, a PR team makes up something like 60% of the management of social media accounts. And this is a reflection that brands understand that social media is too big a task for just one person. It's no longer the cool kid who is on Instagram who's going to handle the social media accounts. And then in terms of how much is spent on social media advertising per month, it's notable that the percentage of companies spending less than 10,000 Rand has now dropped below half. Previously, it was always well over half of the respondents spending a minimal amount of under 10,000 Rand a month. Now you're seeing 1 in 5 companies spending more than 50,000 Rand a month, and we expect that to keep growing. And then in terms of live streaming, getting back to the whole Clubhouse story, where live events, live streaming is becoming a bigger and bigger competitive differentiator. 63% of brands have not yet caught up to it. But the 36% who have is a big jump from last year's 28%. And we can expect to see that constantly growing as the platforms themselves make streaming functionality an integral part of their platform, but also of the potential brand experience. And then this is where we look at the challenges facing the big brands, is the effectiveness in using social media platforms. So even Facebook, which is a well-established, a well-understood platform, less than 40% of brands say they're very effective. Although when you add up the very effective and quite effective, then you suddenly come to around 2/3 of the respondents. And let's contrast that with a new kid in town, which is Clubhouse. And amongst those who are using it, there is very low levels of effectiveness. Almost no one is highly effective in this area, or even quite effective. And the vast majority are not effective. And that's a reflection of the fact that it's new, that its audience is still limited because it's only on iOS, and the brands themselves haven't figured out how to use it yet. A very similar situation exists with TikTok, which has now been around for a few years. We are starting to understand what works on TikTok. But here the issue is that the platform is evolving very fast and its user base is evolving very fast. And the brands are scrambling to keep up with it. Almost as low a level of effectiveness as on Clubhouse from a proportionate point of view. But bear in mind, far more brands are now using TikTok, and they're still getting to grips with it. And that's really the theme of brand activity on social media. They're getting more engaged, they're putting more people into it, putting more budget into it, but still trying to catch up with what is the best strategy. Have a look at Twitter, which has been around for a few more years, and you have a far higher level of effectiveness, but still not exceptionally high. If you add the very effective and the quite effective, you are talking still about less than half of companies finding themselves effective. And again, it's a reflection of the fact that Twitter moves on, the audience moves on, and the brands, just when they have got to grips with how it worked previously, are having to shift their strategies again. And a high proportion of them are not finding themselves very effective. But bear in mind, 4 in 10 being very effective on Twitter is a lot of brands who are effective. And then looking at two of the outliers, Signal, which only came to prominence in the past few months, really, when Facebook announced that they would be integrating WhatsApp data with Facebook data for advertisers. And suddenly Signal became the new game in town, still at a very low level of usage. But what's very clear is that the brands have no idea how to leverage Signal. But the same applies to Snapchat. And Snapchat, appealing to the youth, also is a challenge to brands, because brands try to guess what the youth want from them, but they're not quite able to meet it. A very small proportion find themselves very effective. 2% of brands using Snapchat. So yes, of course, there are highly effective brands. There are the big names that are creating Snapchat filters and the like, who are finding it very effective. But they're few and far between. The rest probably need to bring a few teenagers on board their social media teams. And then this really sums up the big issue. Do you have the right skills in place to leverage and manage social media effectively in 2021? And you can see a very low proportion have an optimal skill set, only 12%. However, when you combine that with those who have a good skill set, then it's almost 2/3 of respondents. But a third are only adequate, and 1 in 10 are ill-equipped or less equipped. So a high proportion of brands don't have the skills in place. This is, of course, a big opportunity for the consultants, the advisors, and the experts who have experience and who can guide the brands. Then, speaking to that, how do you plan to improve social media skills this year? And the biggest move is investing in training current people. 2/3 of brands are going to train the people who are using their social media or running their social media platforms, and that's up from 53% last year. We saw these kinds of high levels of training happening previously, but in 2020, training almost vanished, well, comparatively speaking, and now it's come back to the fore again. But specialist social media agency at the highest level ever, in fact, double what it was just 3 years ago, and we can expect to see that continuing to rise over the next year as brands realize they don't have the internal skills. And then the vexing issue of paid social media influencers, that 60% looks big, but the reality is that the 40% who are using paid social media influencers is massive. It's up from 30% or just under 30% a year before. So a huge increase in the proportion of brands that are using paid social media influencers. And then in terms of the returns that social media has brought to brands, the number one far and away is brand awareness. And that's up massively from last year as well. In 2020, 54% reported brand awareness, still the biggest benefit. And that's gone up to 64%. But the real massive shift is in sales, whereas in 2020, only 13% said that sales were among the returns they got, similar to 2019, in fact. So it seemed like that would be set in stone. That leaped to 35% in 2021 in terms of return from investment in social media. And that should actually be the wake-up call to brands who are not focused on sales, who don't have an effective social media presence, that this is actually a direct impact on the bottom line if they do it right. Then a quick snapshot of some of the main social media platforms. Again, you can get the more detailed data from the report itself, and we'll discuss this as well very shortly. But as Oresti mentioned, 25 million active social media users. That's not necessarily all the people registered on social media platforms, but the number who are active social media users. And you'll see when we mention the Facebook numbers that that's not the full picture. But the change in the number of active users is quite high, up 3 million at the end of last year compared to end of 2019. So strong growth, a strong level of active usage, but the clue to why people are so active is the extent to which they are using their mobile phones. So in other words, they have access to social media wherever they are and at any time. So the vast majority of social media users, 98.5%, are accessing it via their mobile phones. These are the most used platforms, and we've incorporated instant messaging with social media platforms here. And that's in order to show the extent to which WhatsApp has come to dominate the social conversation, and also highlighting the point that WhatsApp has become a tool for brands as well, and for companies who want to reach their audiences or communicate with their audiences. It's quite perilous in the time of the Protection of Personal Information Act, but it's a massive opportunity for companies to reach consumers. And then you see YouTube coming in second there, and YouTube saw one of the biggest growths that we've yet seen in an established social media platform over the past year. Facebook's reachable audience in terms of advertising is 23 million, but in fact, its user base is something like 27 million. That means that a proportion of Facebook users are not highly active users. They're not using it every day or can't be reached via advertising. And the proportion of increase in the addressable Facebook market is 1 million per quarter. Every quarter, 1 million more people can be reached through advertising on Facebook. And then Instagram, as you saw earlier, this is the one that's leaped to the fore in terms of brands, and these are the reasons why. The total user base is now past 10 million. Highly active users, 7.1 million, and that is up from 4.7 million the year before. So while the user base hasn't shifted dramatically, it was 9 million previously, the proportion of highly active users has shifted dramatically. And the reason for that is that brands are driving active engagement. So the big migration here has been from personalities driving Instagram to brands driving Instagram. And they seem to have a stronger effect on engagement in terms of highly active users, because they're providing more substance than the personalities have been providing. LinkedIn numbers. 2019 was 7.5 million, which was fairly strong growth, but 2020, 8.4 million LinkedIn users in South Africa. For what was already a mature platform and a professional platform, that represented incredibly strong growth. And that, as the report will show you, also had a lot to do with the pandemic. People turned to LinkedIn to find jobs, to network, and to try to keep themselves going. And you can see globally also very strong growth from 610 million to 740 million. So South African growth in LinkedIn reflected the global growth. And you can see that our trajectory of social media usage is pretty much in line with the global trajectory. And then Twitter numbers, 2019 was 9 million, and 2020 passed the 10 million mark as well. So we're seeing similar growth as with Instagram, although far more difficult to get to grips with marketing to a Twitter audience than an Instagram audience. And the report itself will delve into some of the reasons for that and the strategies behind it. But finally, I thought I'll share with you what the dominant vibe is on Twitter, the top hashtags and the top emojis. And you can see there's a mix of the political, the social, the COVID-19, and the activities of entertainers as well, with Casper Nyovest and DJ Sabu coming into play as well. But always my favorite part of this presentation every year is the top emojis. And the first two represent laughter and fun, and only then come the tears. But with love also coming into the picture before the broken hearts, and a little bit of thanks and prayer coming in, along with some sadness. So a mix of emotions, but the dominant emotion on Twitter over the past year was fun and laughter. And we can all do with a little bit of that in our lives. Thank you very much.
Cool, Arthur. Thanks. Thank you very much for that. And guys, whoever's got questions, I see some of the questions are coming through. And I'll ask them nearer the end of the presentation. So Lerato, I'm going to start with you. So I know there's a mix between instant messaging and social media. But if you look at that report that Arthur just showed us, you'll see that the majority of the population of consumers are sitting on WhatsApp, 93.2% on WhatsApp, 94.4% on YouTube, and 86.7% on Facebook. Okay, but when you're talking to the respondents and the brands and the rest of it, where are they actually? Which media are they using? And even though Facebook is number 3 here, Facebook is number 1 with the brands, and WhatsApp and YouTube only come in at 5 and number 4. From a media strategy performance, from a media strategy perspective, why do you think that is?
Well, look, I mean, when it comes to looking at it from a brand's perspective as well as a strategic perspective, every channel and every platform has a specific objective and a purpose as to how each brand can leverage it so that it can actually add value to the brand and the objectives that they're trying to achieve. Granted, especially in the previous year, WhatsApp had the highest usage numbers. Also taking into account that data usage on WhatsApp is much lower than the other channels. However, from a brand perspective, it was a tough year. We've been in a pandemic. And ultimately, I think there are two core objectives for every brand, which is maintain consistency from a brand awareness perspective and ensure that you add value by increasing sales numbers, ultimately, be it if it's an FMCG or it's a telco, or even if it's banking. The ultimate goal is to get the business to continue growing despite the circumstances around a pandemic or whatever economic issues that we might be experiencing at a time. So from a brand perspective and an advertising perspective, one would have to obviously consider what are the objectives for each brand, what is it that they're trying to achieve, how they're trying to actually leverage those objectives, on what channels and how.
Cool. So Tumi, as a strategist, okay, you have all these different brands coming at you, and just some of the effectiveness rates as Arthur spoke about. Corporate blog 35% said little or no effect in terms of effectiveness, and that's up from last year of 11%. So 11% said last year corporate blogs were had no or little effect, whereas this year it's 35%. Twitter 37 said little or no effect, up from 24. Although 38% said quite or very effective, up from 28. So there's this dichotomy between the two. There's so much out there, and there's more coming on stream, as we saw with Clubhouse, etc. As a strategist perspective, how do you decide in terms of where your brands need to be, and how do you deal with it, and specifically on the effectiveness of these particular channels?
Well, Oresti, for me, what's very evident in the report, and I think Lerato and Arthur have alluded to it already, 2020 versus 2021 has actually tested the agility of brands to adapt to where the consumer is. Equally, the dichotomy of consumers being able to use their agency, right, to communicate and feedback to brands. So what we're seeing is that gap between strat as it has been created almost retrospectively and adapting to where things are going, where the future is going. And I think that, with another client that I service, we talk about, I'm going to quote my clients actually, they talk about the 70-20 10 principle, creating room for experimentation, innovation. And I think it's very, very evident in the deferral of social media management. If you reflect back a couple of years ago, the social media management was deferred to like the young buck in the team, the experimental youth, so to speak, of the team. And I think that creating time for experimentation and innovation is very, very important now more than ever, because the world is changing so rapidly. And I think it's that mindset that needs to kick in from a brand point of view.
Yeah, there's also when we're looking at the survey in terms of some of the brands, very few, but some of the brands are kind of pulling off out of some of these platforms, which I think is not great, because whether you're off the platform or on the platform, there's still going to be talkability around you, whether you love it or not. That's irrelevant. You should still be there. But the fact that there can be such a big backlash on specifically Twitter more than most of the other platforms. Strategically, how do you think brands are dealing with this kind of engagement when there's backlash to that brand?
I think that Twitter has been a very interesting minefield, because it tends to be it tends to be quite a catalyst for crisis and crisis comms, and that risk mitigation, that reputational risk aspect, that strategy needs to be in place. But I don't think there's enough agility to consider the impact of 280 characters on your brand. And I think the social movements have demonstrated that. The power of the hashtag continues to demonstrate that. And if I think about corporate brands and corporate value chains, I consider the approval processes one has to go through just to put in place the right boundaries, the right risk solutions. And I think we're still struggling in all reality. And I think some investment, once again, into that responsiveness needs to kick in.
Talk about that. Yeah, sorry, Tumi?
I'm saying very few brands are getting it right, and I think it's also informed by category. In certain categories, it's far easier. The damage is less enduring. Fast food being a category where we've seen numerous stories showing up. The recovery rates kind of being quite fast.
And I guess as well, what you're saying to me, it also ties into the growth in brands and companies investing in upskilling their existing teams, specifically to actually tailor them and groom them so that they are ready for cases where the power of the hashtag gets out of hand, and they're actually able to manage their PR a lot better and have a level of agility when it comes to what to do, what not to do, what to say, what not to say, and how to actually manage it so that it still ties into the right way of how the brand wants to paint a picture of this is the correct brand representation that we want to have across the social platforms, and also tying that back into how paid media can also support that stance.
Yeah.
So I think one cannot exist without the other, and looking at the report and the data itself, it's quite fascinating to actually see that the learnings from 2020 have been quite, I suppose, therapeutic for brands, and it's giving an allowance for them to actually evolve past the old school ways of actually doing things and operations, because we are evolving within the social media landscape with the introduction of new platforms that are giving the likes of Facebook and Instagram a run for their money. I mean, look at what TikTok is doing, you know?
Yeah. I was skirting around this a little bit, but I'm going to call it, putting myself out there. I also think that the right generational mix in the skills is very important. The input of a digital native into Strat is very, very different from someone that is not. And I think it's important now more than ever to be able to have the right mix and outlook. And I think, even as I look at us here as a panel, I'm like, yes, way to go. Let's see more of that, maybe. Yeah.
And also, there's also an ongoing trend within the industry, to be honest, of having more hybrids. And I guess that ties into what you're saying. Instead of having a one siloed strategist and a hybrid strategist that actually understands all platforms, all channels, and how one speaks to the other, and also the core fundamental understanding of the foundation of what works across the channels and what doesn't work across the channels, and utilizing those skill sets to ensure that brands are actually reactive in the right manner across the channels and speaking to their audiences, the diverse audiences across the channels in the right manner too. That way it doesn't even harm their brands, and you'll see awareness goes up, positive hashtags increase, sales numbers go up. It's a domino effect.
If I can just reiterate what both Lerato and Tumi have alluded to, which is that diversity in social media teams is critical. And we've seen this globally as a conversation, that diversity in technology teams is important for tech companies. And there's numerous reasons for that. But in social media, it is critical. It's not just a benefit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also what you're saying, Lerato, is not only in terms of getting all those social media platforms right, but how do they, from an omni-channel perspective, how do you tie that into TV advertising, into everything else? Because the more channels you're ultimately using, the more people you can get. There was a research, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago, and I think it was by the outdoor the guys from the Outdoor Association, and in that, if you're only utilizing one channel, you only get to see a certain amount of consumers. But if you're going on to 2 or 3, it grows up kind of exponentially, and I suspect the same happens within social media. Tsebanang, I think, yeah.
So I wanted to add to that. I think that's crucial because all these channels sort of give you a vast amount of data sets, and there's different audiences across different channels. And what's crucial when we talk about effectiveness across these channels is to understand the voice of the consumer across different channels. How do we as brands obviously position ourselves to understand not only the consumers that we assume are consumers, but the audiences out there that are speaking around industry insights about our brand that we hadn't considered in the first place. So how do we structure all this data to be able to give us valuable insights and understand different things about various consumers? And what I tend to find a lot with the clients that we service is that really then starts to understand, what do I want to get out of it? Ultimately, we've got crisis management, we've got competitor analysis, we've got industry insights. When you start to understand those various objectives and pillars, you start to understand where your clients might be and the voice of the consumer overall.
Yep. While you're heading up on stage now, Tsebanang, let's just talk about some of that rival RQ data in terms of benchmarking against the industry on that's within that report. How can brands utilize that benchmarking study? What is that benchmarking study all about, etc.? Do you want to just give us a little bit of insights into that?
Yeah, so typically we find our clients sort of use a platform such as Rival IQ and benchmarking data to really understand what people are doing, on their channels or on social media, so to speak. There are a lot of assumptions. You can see people sort of engaging with your various channels, but not really understand exactly how to benchmark yourself against either your competitors or obviously other global brands. So we tend to find that benchmarking is crucial because we then see exactly what's the comparative analysis against not only sort of local players, your regional players, but also global players. Now, once we understand that, we understand exactly where are they engaging with our channels and how do we actually make better use of that. Also, we're able to go a bit deeper and more granular and then understand in terms of from a different local brand perspective. So which brands are we particularly competing against? Where are they actually sort of putting out their content and who's actually engaging with it? And then we start to see that it's not a one size fits all. And that's the idea of benchmarking, because we make certain assumptions and we get it so wrong more often than not. And being able to have this crucial data to say, well, where I thought my consumers are engaging with me, they're actually not engaging with me, but they are doing so for various content and they're doing so for various competitors. So it's to be able to get that full picture and then be able to tailor your content strategy specifically to various channels and to various consumers.
Yep. And I think Francois, our head of analysis within the report, has written a great article in terms of how do we measure? Okay, what are the objectives? What are the brand objectives? What are company objectives? What are the communication objectives? And how do you measure that against your own objectives, but also seeing what the competitors are ultimately doing, because those objectives may need to change and evolve and morph at the end of the day. So I think that's key. Yeah.
What we tend to find, and it's quite crucial, because you can get a 20% increase across a certain channel and think that you're actually doing well and pumping money into that. When you look at the industry average, are we really doing well? And that is really what the data there is there to tell us, to really see, from an industry perspective, are we flattering ourselves because we've put a lot of money behind this, but ultimately when we look at it overall, we're not actually moving anywhere? Or did we think we're doing badly? I mean, we get clients who will come and ask and say, how do we compare? Because we made certain assumptions. And one of the best things that we do is we give them the data to be able to effectively understand where they actually sit.
Yeah. Arthur, on the group, they're talking about iOS and their new privacy adaptations into iOS 14. What do you think of that, and how do you think that's going to affect the brands? And I think Lerato and Tumi also come in on this, but because I do think it's a really critical perspective. How will that affect brands going forward?
Brands may not like what I'm going to say or agree with it, but in fact, they're doing the brands a big favor by taking away their part of their ability to be creepy. It's very creepy for us to experience brands being almost in our minds, kind of knowing what we're thinking. We've had numerous conversations, all of us, over the last few years, that it is so weird. I was just talking about this product and then I saw an ad about it. And that is the creepy factor in marketing coming into play. And I think to some extent, Apple has heard that and they're trying to address that. But generally speaking, it means that brands have to target audiences in terms of segmentation of large groups and in terms of meeting people where they want to be, not where the brands are forcing them to be.
Tumi, I saw you nodding your head a lot, as did Lerato, so go for it.
I really enjoyed that description, the creepy factor. I was actually noting down a couple of verbs that are associated with, I think, social media usage from a brand perspective. One of the verbs that stood out for me, I think it was, I think Arthur, you said it actually, around brands being left kind of scrambling to keep up with the innovation. The other verb that I picked up, and which I think talks to our reality, is actually that idea of like deepening our relationship, deepening our understanding. But for me, social media, since the advent of social media, has also always been around one, constant learning, but also timing in innovation. So for me, the iOS response to the world of Popia is very, very important, and it's innovation in the right time when it's most relevant to brands and consumers.
Lerato, you want to make a comment? Because you also...
Yeah, definitely. I mean, listen, ultimately, yes, as panelists and as marketers, we are consumers first. At the end of the day, we are human, we are consumers, and we know what works for us and what doesn't work for us. And I think with what's currently happening now with the Popia Act, it's taking into consideration our need for our privacy to be respected, and for brands to essentially readjust and re-strategize and reframe their approach to consumers in a way that does not infringe on their privacy, but rather take into account that there are certain requirements that should be in place before you can think that you can contact me, And from a paid media perspective, I think every agency that is representing every single brand out there should already be making plans and taking initiative to, from the 1st of July, ensure that those particular parameters are in place to ensure that consent is given across all their marketing initiatives for information to be shared with the consumer, knowing that I am giving consent, I have seen this up front, and I am also giving the brand permission to contact me, Yeah. So I'm all for it as a consumer as well as a marketer, because ultimately, if we were to continue the way that we were previously, there are a lot of negative sentiment that comes with it and negative backlash that has come with it. And As a consumer, I'm also very happy that it's coming to an end. But also as a marketer, I'm also proud to say that at least we're moving in a direction that is not harmful to our consumers and our target audiences across all our various campaigns. But it's more of a respect factor than anything else, which I'm appreciative of because of it, So the creepiness goes away, Arthur.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the build-up of sometimes in terms of not trusting the brands, I think this is going to help quite a lot within that growing sentiment of distrusting brands. Sorry, Tumi, Lerato?
I like the words you use in terms of respect, because what came to my mind is not only respect, but authenticity and integrity. And I think that is exactly where you tend to find brands you're moving towards sort of authentic content and the integrity of it all. And I think that is quite crucial with this act.
Yeah. Here's a question from the comments section, MediaWeb Online. Okay. Comments, insight on Gen Z and their soon-to-be buying power. Given the pace of change, TikTok, Reels, paparazzi, and a huge shift into VR and AR, do marketers actually understand this Gen Z group? Tumi?
I think that there isn't an innate understanding of the Gen Z group, but I also think perhaps the lens should be, what are they teaching us? Where's the aptitude to learn? I think even as we talk about, this report, we talk about it being kind of future focused, future orientated, because what we've done is the survey has been curated upfront. And I think that habit of staying in survey mode and constantly learning from the future is very, very important. Unfortunately, for a lot of us in the world of strat, in the world of branding, learn from research that is retrospective. So we're planning for the future with past information. So for me, yes, is Gen Z clearly understood? I don't entirely think so. Is there room to learn? Yes. Is the learning model slightly different? Absolutely. And I think the value of listening kicks in right now. It's much more important to listen.
Adding diversity, maybe on our groups, maybe we should add some younger people as well in terms of this, to just kind of get some of the insights as well,
Absolutely.
So going back to the survey, why is your company using social media? And I see here a couple of those questions kind of coming up, and it goes back to Lerato, yours using omni-channels, going into the different social medias platforms. Why is your company using social media? And 75% have said it's a core part of a campaign, which means that brands are understanding the reality on how you need to use the different mediums, the different platforms, the different spaces, be it advertising, PRs, digital, social media, etc., really to kind of pass that information across. And that's increased from 69% up to 77%. And I think that's really cool. And I think we'll see the growth on that. But the other very interesting bit, and I don't know how you've seen it from a media agency perspective, is that the respondents are using social media to lower costs of the campaign, up from 12% last year up to 27% this year. So social media, the respondents are finding it's a lot. It lowers the cost of actually doing their campaign. Do you see the same happening, Lerato, within your group?
So in this year alone, there has been quite a number of brands that have obviously decreased some of their spends on social media platforms due to an area of reasons. Some I cannot mention, but one thing I can definitely say for sure is that more and more brands are becoming aware of what are the tools that they need to be able to effectively market within the social media space. And there is a growing demand to have more AI tools. There's a growing demand to have accelerated data reporting tools, and obviously those come at a cost, and to have to utilize tools that allow for omni-channel tracking, as well as understanding how media across the channels over and above just social media tie into each other. So there's a movement of the budget from social media, but that investment is going in other places where it will in the long run benefit the brands, for them to effectively be able to advertise to their desired audiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah. One of the surprises for me, following on that, and again, I want you to comment on this, Lerato, is really how much you spend on social media per month, and 10 to 20,000 rand a month increased by 100%, which is a huge increase, but it's a small value. And even the 50,000 and above. I thought a lot more brands would be spending a lot more money. Do you not think that either why do you find that? Are brands kind of concerned about it? Are they not understanding that medium as well as they should? Oh, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. So I think one, it's what brands in what industry fall under that particular bucket, because we could potentially be talking about SMEs here, and we do know that that's a totally different ball game altogether. Whereas your FMCGs and the bigger brands and the banks and the telcos, that's a totally different ball game on its own, And for the ones that are investing less, I think definitely it could be a case of lack of understanding as to what is it that they're doing and why they're doing it. And what are their core objectives? What is it that they're trying to get out of it? And perhaps maybe that is why they're not spending as much as they should be, because they don't understand the objectives that they should be running campaigns for. And there's also the discussion of, yes, they have media budget, but they don't necessarily have creative budget or creative curation budget to have the right creative to run on the right channels that will achieve the results that they are desiring, in a sense that you cannot be taking a TVC video from TV and plucking it on YouTube. It's not going to work. So factors such as that also play a role in budget allocation and how brands are actually upweighting and taking away budgets, and how they're reallocating their budget simply because of those factors, Yeah,
and it's amazing. I'll come to you now, Tumi. It's amazing how many brands actually do take their TV commercial and put it onto YouTube or whatever. And it's kind of crazy. I'm telling you, most of us, it would be cool research, but I'm telling you, most of us just skip it after 5 seconds. So it's kind of a waste. They need to do a proper strategy and a proper campaign for things like social media and specifically YouTube. Tumi, you put up your hand? Oh, sorry.
Just to add to it, and that's another thing. There is the strategy element, which can be 100% tight-knit. But then there's the content strategy element that ties into the strategy that may not necessarily speak to the core strategy. And then it goes back to the budget allocations and the cuts of the creatives that they actually are producing that either work or don't work on these particular channels. And that's a big discussion that I think a lot of agencies are still having with brands and creative agencies to date. And I think Tumi will also agree with me on this one.
Absolutely, Lerato. I also think that we need to consider the times that we're in, the financial times that we're in. Just as consumers are financially stressed, so are brands. At the end of the day, you've got to sell, you've got to meet your bottom line. And I think that fine balance between risk mitigation and delivering on your sales objective is important. So you want to use your social media in such a way that it helps you accelerate or deliver on sales, or you just cut your risk. Really, that simple.
Yeah. Arthur, do you want to add on to that at all?
No, I think that sums it up pretty well. It gives a fairly good perspective. I do see that there's a massive amount of questions coming through. Maybe we should move to the audience questions now.
I'm trying to, to overcome, let me look at the question. So Arthur, I'm going to ask you a quick question, then I'm going to go to those comments right now. Is we're talking about the importance of Lerato was talking about the importance about content and about paid advertising. So paid, owned and shared and the rest of it. When looking at this, it looked like brands were posting once per week is 55% and once per day is 32%. Do you want to kind of comment on that, specifically in relation to content versus paid advertising, etc.? While I'm going to look at the questions.
It's a very complex question for many brands, but what it comes down to is giving value. If you are able to post something that gives value, by all means, post every day, post twice a day. But if you're simply rehashing the same hashtag, so to speak, then you're just spamming your audience. So be very careful about creating content with value and content that is perceived as spam. The more you post content with value, the more you're adding value to your audience. The more you're posting content with spam, the more you are seen as intruding in the lives of your audience. You don't want to be seen as intrusive. You want to be seen as adding value. And that's really the bottom line with regard to frequency of posting and also the content of your posts.
Cool. I'm going to go into some of these questions now. While brands are putting more focus on corporate blogs, what are the most important factors they should consider for the future when engaging with influencers or public figures? Net Libovitz, thanks for that question. Tumi, do you want to answer that?
I'd like to jump in. Yes, I think a very important factor when using influencers is perhaps alignment of the influencer brand and the actual corporate brand. We are not short of stories where things, go dismally wrong, and just because the right vetting and the right check-ins had not been put in place. And I think that in the short term, sometimes what brands want to do is use the benefit of a particular voice as a once-off and then move on, which also kind of takes away from the integrity, I think, of the brand narrative and the brand story. So for me, vetting, very important, and considering the value of what the influencer stands for in relation to the brand.
Yep. Tsebanang, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's got to be a definite alignment, and there's got to be a core value alignment between the brand and the actual influencer. We obviously monitor influencers through technology to understand exactly how effective these influencers are. And, quite often you'll see that ultimately the influencers that a brand might align with are not the ones that are performing the most, in terms of social media. And you tend to find they're actually sort of micro influencers that are actually having a bigger effect on your campaign or your strategy than the ones that you're actually sort of paying for. So there is that alignment, and there needs to be a proper alignment between the actual influencer and the actual brand story. But long term, what they stand for long term, not just in a moment to be able to sort of try and eke out the best value because the influencer's in a particular space or at the present moment.
Yeah, that's I hear you, Tsebanang, but I think that's why, from an Ornico perspective, how often we tell our brands, let's understand what do you want to try and achieve out of each of those campaigns. Let's measure it properly, let's give you feedback on it, so that you're not ultimately wasting across all the mediums. It doesn't really matter whether it's advertising, whether it's PR, whether it's social, whether it's digital, or across each of those. There's always an objective for doing that campaign, and sometimes we forget about that. And like I saw Banele Shabalala saying, it's so often you see many brands are just guilty of just copying and pasting, as Arthur was saying. And monitoring some of these brands, you see that so vividly sometimes, and it's crazy. We need to, from a brand perspective, we need to really understand what are the objectives, the company objectives, number one. But number two, what is that brand objective, and how does that align to the company objective? And are you really reaching it? And if you're not, let's stop it quickly and let's make those changes as soon as we can. Another quick, yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think what you tend to find the mistake is really sort of short-term gain, over long-term benefits. And you tend to find the best match-ups between influencers and brands are the ones where this is actually, as you said, strategically been thought out, and there's a long-term plan to this. It's not just so we can actually sort of get maximum effect in terms of what we're trying to do now. And I think that's really where the mistakes are made.
Yeah. So we're going to stay on for a little while, but we said this webinar was going to be an hour. We're sitting on 1 hour and 2 minutes and 51 seconds. So those, you're welcome to stay on. I'm going to ask a few more questions. I see on screen there's one from Larry Kamalo, which I'm going to ask now. But so those of you that this report will be available to everybody that's here, but also to the industry at large, free of charge, as Arthur said. So we'll tag that. We'll put it onto social media where you can get it from. Obviously on the Ornico site, you'll be able to get it, plus other platforms. So let me just ask. So everyone there, before I ask the question, thank you very much for attending it. It's really been cool. There have been some really insightful discussions around this. And to the team, thank you very much. I'll thank you again later, but just so that those guys that need to go. Larry says, interesting mindset about adding youth to teams to leverage new platforms like TikTok. We relegate new social media platforms to young people and don't bother to upskill the old guard. Thoughts? Larry, I think the old guard, we've given up on them. No, I'm joking. That's a good point. Good point, Larry. Arthur, what are your thoughts around that? Because that's a really interesting point of view.
Interesting and an important comment as well. In fact, the problem with the old guard is often they don't want to learn new things, and that's why they relegate it to the so-called youth. What we need is a two-way skills transfer, but also an appetite for learning new skills. All the great business leaders will tell you that you never stop learning, and certainly that has to be the case in this environment. But the significant issue for me here is that there needs to be a two-way skills transfer. I have never learned more than I have from people far younger than me, taking me into new areas of activity. And I believe that if the industry is more open to the older learning from the younger, and vice versa, because that adds experience to skill, then you start addressing the issue that Larry is raising.
Just to add to that, and I think the core fundamental part of that definitely does have to lie in the environment that the old and the new work in, right? For there to be an environment and an energy within the working environment that allows for cross-upskilling and cross-upskilling and training each other. That allowance to know that I can go to the next person who is younger than me or older than me to actually ask for them to actually teach me, guide me, so that I can know more, learn more. I think without that type of an environment, then there's a barrier between just to what extent can the old guards be educated? To what extent can the younger ones be educated?
Yeah.
Cool. I just want to jump in. Sorry, before we go to the next one, please. I also think the learning happens. It's inevitable. So you either learn as a result, as a consequence of having resisted, or you learn proactively. But the learning invariably happens. The idea is to actually be proactive about learning from diverse sources. But it's inevitable.
And Lerato, I think you're right. I mean, I mentor a lot of young people, and they come to me for information, but I think I learn more out of them than sometimes I feel they're learning from me. and it's crazy to kind of, not crazy, but it's really exhilarating to really engage. And those cross platforms are things, as Arthur said right at the beginning, it happens in tech. Why can't it happen in advertising and communication? The next question, this question we've already asked, it's on screen. So I'm going to go into one of the other questions now until we bring others on the screen. But who has better return on investment? Millennials, Gen X, boomers, or Gen Z who still have access to their parents' income? Great question. Lerato, just because you're in media.
It's a good question. You know what? I think this one is relative. And I say relative because from a return on investment perspective, we need to be considerate of what is the product, you know? And that particular product, is it relatable for the generation X or Z, or is it the millennials who will buy more into the product? Or does it cross correlate across all the generations? So it's honestly relative. It's relative. There is not a solid answer on that one from my end.
Part of the reason it's relative, if I may jump in here, Oresti, is because generational theory is severely flawed. The concept of the millennial is my favorite example of flawed marketing theory, because technically a millennial is aged right now from 21 to 41. How do you put the 41-year-old in the same category as the 21-year-old? And that applies to every one of the generational groups because they span such a wide age group. Even the so-called boomers, we don't have boomers in South Africa because we didn't have a baby boom after the war. That's the definition of boomers as well. It's a very American concept. So the moment you try to apply generational theory to marketing, you find yourself tied up in knots and confusion, and also very poor targeting. So by all means, target people based on how old they might be, but not because they belong to a large cohort. That's the wrong means of targeting. And just getting back to the whole issue of the Apple anti-tracking approach, it's forcing people to target people based on their interests rather than on exactly who they are or what their demographics are. And that's really what marketers, what social media teams have to understand, is that even within the same age group, you have vastly different interests. So you need to target people based on those interests and not on creepy demographics.
I think. Yeah.
I want to add to that. I mean, as you know, I sit primarily in the sort of social listening, consumer insight space, and that's one thing. You tend to find people make a mistake, or we're moving away from. Really understanding your audience. There's a lot of data out there on social media where people are actually telling you about themselves, and we sort of blanket them into these sort of age groups when their interests are so vast. And companies tend to think that this is my target audience. This is the shape, or this is the profile of my consumer. We do a lot of audience analysis. We do a lot of audience interest to really understand, and you'll be shocked as to how companies get it wrong. And that's why we use social listening and consumer insights to really understand the affinities in terms of different groups, the interests of different groups, and how we go beyond sort of these groups that we actually put them in, or we assume that they sit as part of.
Absolutely. The persona of the person is also really, really important. And it's just sometimes really difficult. But the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that it cannot be done. And I think getting insights just makes it much easier. Yeah. Next question here. I'm going to read it. Do audiences value always on? Getting a response to tag sent at 9 p.m. at 9:05. When a brand posts and then switches off, does that have a detrimental effect? Okay, there's a lot of questions here. So maybe we should do it one step at a time. Do audience value always on? And getting a response to a tag sent at 9 p.m. at 9:05, does that kind of work? So to me, that always on. Do audiences value that always on approach?
I think it goes back to the point that both Arthur and Lerato had made previously, that fine line between spamming your consumer versus providing content that is valuable. So I think always on has to be determined by what content and or message you are trying to relay. And in that way, it is valuable. And then brand post switching on and off, again, it correlates with that strategy and what it is that you're trying to deliver. And is community management still valuable? At least just based on this report, for me, it stood out head and shoulders that community management is still absolutely valuable. Perhaps the depth and the mechanics of it is what has varied, but we're seeing based on the survey that community management is no longer an outsourced capability. It's increasingly brought in-house. So yes, I do think it's still quite valuable.
Cool. I think this is a really, really great question. Okay, let me just do the one on the board at the moment. With COVID-19 significantly lowering the marketing budgets for most brands, how can brands ensure that they use the limited funds to leverage as much value in social media advertising as possible? Lerato.
Definitely allocating budget to build rapport and maintain their relationship with their audiences. It's important that their target audiences know that, and a brand actually takes initiative to establish themselves as a brand that cares, especially in this pandemic. Because if they get that right, it's not a hard decision to make as a consumer to go into a store and purchase their product, simply because you know that the brand is with you, is aligned with you, cares, and is doing enough on the channels where they can actually speak to you to show you that they care, to speak to you in a manner that you know that they actually care about what's currently going on right now. And I'm not saying let them tap into talking about or posting about politics. No. This pandemic is affecting all of us in various ways. Find your voice as a brand to show yourself as a brand that cares.
Yeah. And depending on your positioning, because Nando's will comment on politics at the end of the day, but some other brands can't do that. You know?
Exactly. So literally allocate your budget for this is for us. This is for our branding. This budget is for brand. It's for the branding task to build ourselves as a brand that cares. And then this set of the budget is to ensure that we drive sales.
Yeah.
I also think a very important soundbite. You know, we keep. I've heard this actually said before that a brand and a brand experience is not what the brand says it is. It's what the consumer reflects back to it.
Exactly.
And now more than ever, consumers will use their agency if the brand is off the mark.
Yep.
So it's very important to show up in an authentic way.
Yep.
Yeah. Can I add to that? Because we work with a lot of tech and around sort of content discovery and content creation. And one of the keys is the consumers are always saying stuff on social media. And you find brands are way off the mark because they have their own message. And you can really do a lot by just really listening and understanding exactly what content's out there and tailoring all of this to really meet the consumer exactly where they want to be met, not where you think they should be. And that is really, really crucial.
But also we find when we're monitoring that the consumer conversations, it's great content at the end of the day for the creative and for the advertising guys 100%. To actually utilize 100%. This.
And that's the key point. There's so much data out there, and consumers are actually, one of the things I love about the social media space is consumers are talking to us not only day, every second. How do you leverage that? How do you bring all that data in to understand exactly where to be? And that is the power of social media. It's literally on demand, and we're getting all this creative content regularly. A lot of our clients use sort of user-generated content because they understand the consumers. They're the best content generators.
Yeah.
If I might just add to that quickly, Oresti, an important aspect of brands dealing with influencers is that they have to ensure that the message that's coming out is authentic. To come back to that word that's been used previously, authenticity, very often the brands want the influencer to push a specific product message or brand message without concern for how that reflects on the influencer. for those who are using influencers, you're going to get far more effective a return on your or a better return on your investment and a more effective messaging if you ensure that what you're putting out is aligned with the influencer's own persona and therefore enhances the authenticity of the message as well as the influencer and the brand. So
yeah, absolutely, and it's so obvious. I mean, this is something that has been spoken about for years. Never mind, you know what I'm saying? And it's crazy. It's also last year, if you remember, in the Psychographica report, that we were looking at the different social media. We're looking at the different social media streams, the different personalities that were coming from one brand, the different personalities that were coming out of Twitter from that same brand, Facebook from that same brand. Instagram, it confuses the consumer at the end of the day, and it's really important to be able to monitor that and be able to then start streamlining it and getting the right information and the right brand persona across. I'm going to do 2 more questions, guys. So thank you for your time. Just the one that's on screen now, Renette. While brands are putting more focus on corporate blogs, what are the most important factors that you should consider for the future when engaging with influencers or public figures? Specifically, that you can see in the report, brands are starting to engage and starting to understand influencers a lot better. So this is specifically related to blogs and not necessarily to social media. So, Arthur, do you want to just give us a quick comment on that?
Yeah, again, the critical issue there is authenticity and value. And I guess ultimately it always comes down to value. And in a corporate blog, there's nothing worse than simply sounding like a press release. In fact, I attended an event yesterday where an online event, of course, where a very significant and prominent executive introduced the proceedings with a 5-minute monologue that was actually a press release that was being read out. And it sounded so incredibly stilted and almost offensive because you knew that he was reading something that had been prepared by someone else. So even at the CEO level, even at the corporate blog level, the same message applies, the same lesson or strategy applies in terms of putting across an authentic message that provides value. And I guess I sound like a stuck record, but authenticity and value is the key to content.
Yep. Okay, final question, guys. So this is, when you say the importance of organic will increase, how do you think this will be successful and how would it combat algorithms? This is a conversation that was happening between 2 people on the group, but I think this is such a absolutely important question for the audience at the end of the day, because algorithms are changing consistently. So let's look at that. So when we say the importance of organic will increase, how do you think this will be successful, and how would it combat algorithms? Lerato.
I'm going to speculate here. I'm going to take a step. It correlates again with greater adherence to the POPIA Act. As data protection kicks in a lot more, I think the power of the algorithm to influence content is going to be mitigated, and that's where the value of organic is going to kick in. This is just me looking at and the algorithms, what the algorithms have shown up on my social versus what I go out in pursuit of, and that's really what I think.
Absolutely. Lerato, do you want to add to that? Because I think it's really those algorithms.
No, I definitely agree with Tumi, and I think also in addition to what she has also touched on is that brands as well as agencies are currently in the process of finding other means and ways to work around how to better prepare for the changes that are to come from a POPIA Act perspective. So certain rollouts are going to take some time. I mean, I know with Google, for example, it's going to take it's gonna take about an extra a year plus for them to start rolling out the privacies that the PAPIA do require. Whereas on the social front, it's as of days from now, but it will require learning. It will require a lot of testing to see what works, what doesn't work, because campaigns, objectives, setups, as well as algorithms, as well as optimization approaches will actually have to change.
Cool. Tsebanang, your final comments?
Yeah, I just think ultimately it's really sort of about listening. One thing I'm a big fan of social media is that there's data out there, and there are nuggets that brands can get that really affect quite a lot in terms of competitiveness. And in this sort of consumer space that we're in, it is very important that we sort of listen to the voice of the consumer. And that is really what the most important thing for me around social media data is, to be able to harness that for brand growth and understanding where to actually meet our consumers, at their greatest need.
Yeah. Arthur, final comments?
Yes, I liked what Cheryl Dubé just said in the chat, that hybrid strategies are key for a full end-to-end campaign. And that ties into Keenan's question about the importance of organic. Algorithms are important in terms of working with the algorithms if you're looking for the numbers, if you want reach, and if those metrics are important to you. But they don't beat the importance of good content, good messaging, and a good hybrid strategy that incorporates the organic side and the algorithmic side of things. But if you simply want to give the audience a good brand experience out there, and you're only looking at the algorithms, you're going to come across as being algorithmic, and therefore the customer experience is diminished. Always think in terms of what the experience is on the other end, and not just what metrics you're reporting back to the client.
Great, guys. And my final comments at the end of the day is that it's really important, this omnichannel. So social media is absolutely critical, and you can see that's the biggest growth area. But I think this omnichannel approach is as important, so that we cannot forget about that. But also, really, I keep stressing how important it is to understand what your objectives are, understand who your consumer is, understand the persona of your consumer, and just align all those. And the important thing is, as Tsebanang said, is really about that listening, not only social listening, but all kinds of listening at the end of the day on all the channels, to really kind of align all that across your different channels. So, guys, thank you very, very much. Tsebanang, you're at the top of my list here, so thank you very much, and thanks to you as well for all those insights. Arthur, I'm going to leave you for last because you are our partner anyway on that. Lerato, thanks for coming in. It was really cool to hear your perspective. And Tumi, as usual, I know we've done a couple of these together and many more. And thank you very much for kind of coming through. And Arthur, thank you. I think this was great. And all of you, if you need this, this is downloadable on both the Ornico and the WorldWideWorx site. I know that we've put it onto the chats, but we'll put it out on social media, etc. In the next hour or so. So, guys, and the video recording will also be shown. So, guys, thank you very much to all to everybody that came through, specifically to our respondents, but all the guys listening on YouTube, Facebook, on all the streams that are happening. Thank you very much, and look forward to next year's report. Thank you.